He invited her to dinner to remind her who she used to be, small, forgettable, replaceable. But the moment Charlotte Hayes stepped into the restaurant, she felt it in the air, that quiet, polished cruelty disguised as elegance, the kind that hid behind crystal chandeliers and $1,000 wine bottles, the kind that smiled before it cut. And she knew, instantly, this wasn't just dinner, this was a stage, and she was the performance. The golden light spilled across marble floors and pressed against her skin as conversations softened into whispers, eyes flickering toward her like she was something out of place, something that didn't belong anymore. And there he was, Ethan Cole, standing from the table with that same effortless charm that had once felt like gravity, pulling her in, anchoring her world. Now it felt rehearsed, calculated, his smile just a fraction too sharp, his hand resting lightly on the back of a woman beside him, younger, polished, perfect in the way Charlotte used to try to be. And for a second, just one fragile second, Charlotte felt the old version of herself stir, the one who used to adjust her posture, soften her voice, shrink just enough to fit into the version of her Ethan preferred. But she didn't move, she didn't shrink, she stood there, steady, even as the weight of a dozen silent judgments pressed against her shoulders. Ethan's voice cut through the low hum of the room, warm, welcoming, just loud enough to gather attention without seeming like it. "Charlotte, you made it," he said, like this was a reunion, like this was kindness, like he hadn't carefully arranged every seat at that table to face her, like he hadn't curated an audience of people who remembered her as his wife, not as herself. The chair across from him was already pulled out, waiting, expectant, a place prepared not for comfort, but for display. And as she walked toward it, the soft click of her heels echoing just a little too clearly against the polished floor, she realized something deeper, something colder. This wasn't spontaneous, it was deliberate. Every glance, every pause, every perfectly timed smile. And as she sat down, smoothing her simple navy dress against her knees, she caught her reflection in the glass of water before her. Not the woman he left, not the one who built her life around his ambitions, but someone quieter, steadier, someone who had learned how to exist without being seen. And for the first time that night, her chest didn't tighten, it settled, because somewhere beneath the tension, beneath the expectation, beneath the carefully laid trap, there was a stillness, a knowing she couldn't quite explain yet, something about the way the room felt too aware, too watchful, like there was more unfolding than what Ethan had planned. And as the waiter poured wine with practiced precision and Ethan leaned back in his chair, preparing to begin whatever performance he had orchestrated, Charlotte lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes without flinching, without apology. And in that silent exchange, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, because for all his control, for all his preparation, there was one thing Ethan didn't see. Not yet. Not in this moment. That tonight, she hadn't come here to be small. The first course arrived like a quiet signal that the performance had begun, silverware glinting under the chandelier light as conversations rose and fell around them. And Ethan lifted his glass with an ease that felt practiced, his voice smooth, almost affectionate, as he began to speak about the past, as if it were something amusing, something harmless. And Charlotte listened as he painted their history into something smaller, something lighter, carefully removing every moment that had once mattered to her, turning years into anecdotes that earned soft laughter from the table. And each word was precise, controlled, never loud enough to be called cruel, but sharp enough to land exactly where he intended. "You always preferred quiet things, Charlotte," he said with a faint smile, his eyes scanning her in a way that felt like an assessment rather than recognition. "Simple places, simple routines. It suited you." And the woman beside him tilted her head slightly, offering a polite, sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes, as if Charlotte were a story she had already been told, a version of someone. Incomplete. And Charlotte felt the weight of that narrative pressing in, the version of herself that had been rewritten without her consent, the version that had been left behind. And for a moment, the old reflex returned, that instinct to explain, to defend, to correct the story before it hardened into truth. But she did not speak. She let the silence stretch, because she understood something now that she had not before. That interruption would only feed the performance, and Ethan continued. Encouraged by the quiet, his tone dipping into something that sounded almost like concern. "I just hope you are doing okay. You know, considering everything." And there it was, the word unspoken but implied, the judgment wrapped in politeness, the suggestion that she had fallen, that she had become less, and a soft murmur circled the table, a ripple of agreement disguised as empathy. And Charlotte felt her fingers tighten slightly around the stem of her glass, the cool surface grounding her as. Memories surfaced uninvited, late nights where she had bent herself into shapes that fit his expectations, conversations where her dreams had been gently dismissed, reframed as impractical, unnecessary, replaced with his ambitions, his plans, his version of success. And she remembered how easily she had believed him, how quietly she had stepped aside, and now here he was, presenting that surrender as her nature, as her limitation, and something inside her shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty, a refusal to accept the version of her he was offering to the room. And as he leaned back in his chair, satisfied, the subtle rise of his chin suggesting the moment had landed as intended, Charlotte finally lifted her glass, her movements slow, deliberate, her expression calm in a way that did not invite interpretation. And for the first time that evening, the silence that followed was not empty. It was controlled. It belonged to her, and somewhere beyond the circle of their table, just at the edge of her awareness, she felt it again, that presence, that watchful stillness, as if someone else in the room had been listening far more closely than the rest, waiting, not for the story Ethan was telling, but for the moment it would finally reveal itself. It happened in the space between breaths, in that fragile pause where the room expected Charlotte to shrink back into silence. And instead she simply sat there, composed, her glass resting lightly between her fingers, her gaze steady in a way that did not challenge, did not plead, but refused to yield. And Ethan noticed it, the slight shift he could not quite name, the absence of the reaction he had carefully engineered. And for the first time that evening his smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before he recovered, leaning forward as if to press the moment further, his voice lowering into something that sounded almost intimate, almost kind. "I just want what is best for you, Charlotte," he said, and the table leaned in again, drawn by the performance, by the quiet spectacle of a man appearing generous while quietly diminishing the woman across from him. And Charlotte felt the words settle over her like a script she had already outgrown, something rehearsed, something that no longer fit. And she realized then that the power he thought he held had always depended on her believing in it, on her accepting the version of herself he presented, and without that, it was nothing more than a hollow echo. And as that understanding settled into her, something else sharpened at the edge of the room. That same presence she had felt before, no longer distant, no longer subtle, but deliberate, watching, waiting. And then it happened, not with a crash or a raised voice, but with a single, unmistakable sound, the slow scrape of a chair against polished marble, cutting cleanly through the low hum of conversation. And one by one, heads turned, attention shifting away from Ethan's carefully constructed narrative toward the source of the interruption. And Charlotte did not turn immediately. She felt it first, that shift in the room, that subtle recalibration of focus. And when she finally did lift her gaze, she saw him, a man rising from a table set slightly apart from the others, a table that carried its own gravity, its own quiet authority, his movements unhurried, precise, as if time itself adjusted to accommodate him. And there was no uncertainty in the way he stepped forward, no hesitation, only intention. And as he approached, the space around them seemed to change, conversations dimming, attention tightening, until the only thing that remained was the measured sound of his footsteps and the silence that followed him. And Ethan straightened in his chair, something in his posture shifting from control to awareness, his eyes narrowing slightly as recognition flickered across his face. But before he could speak, before he could reclaim the moment, the man stopped beside Charlotte, close enough for his presence to be undeniable, yet not imposing, not overpowering. And for a brief second, Charlotte felt the warmth of his proximity, steady, grounded. And then he spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room without ever needing to rise. "Be careful how you speak," he said, each word measured, deliberate, and then a pause. A single breath that seemed to stretch time itself, before he added, "That is my queen." And the words did not explode, they settled, heavy and absolute, breaking something unseen but deeply rooted in the space between them. And in that instant, the room shifted completely. The narrative Ethan had built unraveling without resistance, replaced by something far simpler, far more powerful, and Charlotte did not flinch, did not react with surprise, because deep down, in that quiet place she had found, within herself, she already knew. She had never needed to be made into anything. She had always been this. And now, finally, the world was forced to see it too. The silence did not shatter. It deepened, settling over the table like a weight no one dared disturb, and Ethan's expression, so carefully maintained all evening, began to fracture at the edges, his confidence slipping not in a dramatic collapse, but in subtle, telling ways. The tightening of his jaw, the slight shift in his shoulders as he recalibrated, searching for control that no longer belonged to him. And the woman beside him went still, her poised smile fading into something uncertain as her eyes moved between Charlotte and the man standing beside her, trying to understand a reality that had just rewritten itself without warning. And Charlotte remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, but everything about her presence had transformed, not because of the words that had been spoken, but because of the truth they had revealed, something that had always been there, quiet and unclaimed, now undeniable. And the man beside her did not look at Ethan immediately. He did not rush to dominate the moment. Instead, his gaze rested briefly on Charlotte, a silent acknowledgement that required no explanation, before he turned his attention outward, not to confront, but to clarify. And when his eyes finally met Ethan's, there was no hostility, no raised voice, only a calm authority that did not need to announce itself, and that absence of aggression made it far more absolute. "I believe introductions were overlooked," he said evenly, his tone measured, as if he were correcting a minor oversight, rather than dismantling the foundation of the evening. And the room leaned in again, but this time not for spectacle, for understanding, for the quiet unraveling of a narrative that had just been exposed as incomplete. And Ethan opened his mouth, perhaps to respond, perhaps to reclaim some version of the control he had so carefully constructed, but the words did not come easily now, because for the first time, he was no longer directing the moment, he was reacting to it, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything, and Charlotte felt it too. The release of something she had carried without realizing it, the weight of needing to be understood, to be defended, to be seen through someone else's approval. And as she sat there, the low hum of the restaurant returning in hesitant waves around them, she understood that none of that was necessary anymore, because the truth did not need to be argued, it simply existed. And the man beside her did not speak again immediately. He did not need to. His presence alone had already redrawn the lines of power in the room, and when he finally moved, it was with a quiet intention, his hand resting lightly on the back of Charlotte's chair, not claiming, not directing, but anchoring. A gesture so subtle it might have been missed if not for the way it shifted the energy around them. And Charlotte allowed herself a single, measured breath, her fingers relaxing slightly against the glass in her hand, her gaze lifting once more, not to Ethan, not to the others at the table, but forward, beyond them, as if the space she occupied had expanded beyond the narrow frame they had placed her in. And in that moment, there was no need for explanation, no need for confrontation, because the evening had already turned, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with something far more enduring, a quiet, irreversible recognition. And as Ethan finally leaned back in his chair, his earlier certainty replaced by something far less stable, the realization settled in, not just for him, but for everyone watching, that the woman he had invited to diminish had never been diminished at all, and the difference now was not that she had changed, but that the room had finally been forced to see her clearly. The shift did not reverse, it settled deeper, like something inevitable finally taking its place. And the room, once filled with the quiet confidence of curated appearances, now carried a different tension, one that no longer belonged to Ethan, because control had slipped from his grasp without a single raised voice. And Charlotte felt it fully now, not as a surge of emotion, but as a calm, grounded certainty, the kind that did not need validation, the kind that existed long before anyone chose to recognize it. And as she slowly set her glass down against the white linen tablecloth, the soft contact barely audible, it felt like the closing of something far older than this evening, a chapter that had quietly ended long before she walked through those doors. And across from her, Ethan attempted to recover, his posture straightening, his expression smoothing as he reached for a version of himself that had always worked. Before, the composed host, the man in control of every narrative. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice measured, but the words lacked the weight they once carried, because the room was no longer listening to him the same way. And even he could feel it, that subtle withdrawal of attention, that quiet shift of allegiance that no one announced but everyone understood. And the woman beside him adjusted slightly in her seat, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness, as if she too was recalculating her place within a story that had just changed direction. And the man standing beside Charlotte did not interrupt, did not challenge. He simply allowed the moment to unfold, his presence steady, unshaken, a silent counterbalance to Ethan's unraveling control. And Charlotte, for the first time, turned her gaze directly toward Ethan, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity, because there was nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. And when she spoke, her voice was calm, even, carrying just enough to be heard without ever needing to rise. "There is no misunderstanding," she said, and the words did not push. They settled, firm and complete, and Ethan paused, just long enough for that truth to register, for the realization to take shape that whatever version of her he had expected to face tonight no longer existed. And Charlotte continued, not to explain, not to justify, but simply to exist within that moment as herself. "You invited me here to remind me of who I was," she said quietly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, her posture unshaken. "But I already know who I am." And there was no sharpness in her tone, no need for emphasis, because the power of it lay in its simplicity, in the absence of anything performative. And as the words settled into the space between them, the final shift occurred, subtle but absolute, the last thread of Ethan's constructed narrative dissolving into something irrelevant, something that no longer held authority over her or the room. And the man beside her glanced at her then, not with surprise, but with a quiet recognition, as if confirming what he had already seen long before this evening began. And Charlotte allowed herself the smallest change, a soft exhale, a release that did not come from victory over anyone else, but from the quiet understanding that she had already won the moment she stopped needing to be seen through someone else's eyes. And as the room slowly resumed its movement, conversations returning in cautious waves, the energy remained altered, permanently shifted, because what had been revealed could not be undone. And Ethan, sitting across from her, finally leaned back, his earlier certainty replaced by something far quieter, something closer to recognition, as he realized that the woman he had tried to reduce no longer occupied the space he had assigned her. And she never would again. The moment did not end when the words were spoken. It expanded, unfolding in quiet layers as the weight of Charlotte's calm certainty settled into every corner of the room. And for the first time that evening, the attention that had once circled her with judgment now returned with something else, something closer to respect, curiosity, even a trace of unease, because the version of her they had expected no longer matched the woman sitting before them. And Charlotte could feel it, not as pressure, but as space, as if the room itself had shifted to accommodate who she had become rather than who she used to be. And beside her, the man remained steady, his presence unchanged, not seeking to dominate the moment, not drawing attention to himself, but anchoring it in a way that made everything else feel smaller by comparison. And when he finally spoke again, his voice carried the same quiet authority, not louder, not sharper, simply undeniable. "Charlotte does not need to explain herself," he said, his tone even, as though stating something obvious, something that had always been true. And the simplicity of it landed more powerfully than any confrontation could have, because it removed the expectation entirely, the unspoken demand that she justify her place, her choices, her worth, and across the table. Ethan's expression tightened again, not with anger, but with the dawning realization that the dynamic he had relied on no longer existed, that the quiet compliance he had once mistaken for weakness had never been what he believed it to be, and Charlotte watched him, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, but with a clarity that allowed her to see him fully for the first time, not as the center of her past, not as the authority he had once seemed to hold, but simply as a man who had mistaken control for connection, and that understanding softened something within her, not into forgiveness, not into reconciliation, but into release. And as the waiter approached hesitantly to clear the untouched plates, the normal rhythm of the restaurant began to reassemble itself around them. Conversations restarting, glasses clinking softly, the illusion of ordinary returning, but the shift remained, woven into the atmosphere in a way that could not be undone, and Charlotte rose slowly from her seat, her movements unhurried, composed, and the simple act of standing carried a quiet finality, as if she were stepping out of something that no longer contained her, and for a brief moment, the room stilled again, not because she demanded attention, but because she no longer avoided it. And the man beside her moved in sync, not leading, not following, simply present. And as Charlotte reached for her coat, the fabric smooth beneath her fingers, she paused, turning back just enough to meet Ethan's gaze one last time. And there was no accusation there, no lingering need for acknowledgement, only a calm, unspoken truth that did not require words. And in that silence, everything that needed to be said already had been. And when she finally turned away, stepping into the soft glow of the restaurant's exit, the weight she left behind did not follow her, because it had never truly belonged to her. And outside, the cool night air met her like something clean, something new, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to breathe fully, not as someone who had endured, not as someone who had proven anything, but simply as someone who had stepped into her own life. Without looking back, the night air felt different the moment Charlotte stepped onto the sidewalk, cooler, sharper, as if the city itself had been waiting for her to leave something behind. And for a few seconds, she simply stood there beneath the soft glow of streetlights, the distant hum of traffic, blending into a steady rhythm that grounded her. And beside her, the man who had shifted everything remained close, not imposing, not urgent, just present, his silence carrying a kind of respect that did not demand explanation. And Charlotte drew in a slow breath, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her coat as she let the last traces of that dining room dissolve from her shoulders. And it surprised her, not the relief, but the absence of anything heavier, no anger, no lingering hurt, just a quiet clarity that felt almost unfamiliar in its simplicity. And when she finally turned to look at him, really look this time, she noticed the details she had only sensed before, the precision in the way he carried himself, the steadiness in his gaze, the kind of confidence that did not need to be displayed because it was already understood. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching comfortably between them, until he tilted his head slightly, his voice low, measured. "You handled that exactly as I expected," he said, not as praise, not as surprise, but as recognition. And Charlotte felt a faint shift inside her at those words, not because she needed validation, but because of how effortlessly he had seen her, without distortion, without assumption. And she gave a small, almost amused breath, her eyes drifting briefly toward the city skyline before returning to him. "You expected that," she said softly, and there was no challenge in her tone, only curiosity. And he nodded once, the movement subtle. "I have been watching you for a while," he replied, his words calm, unhurried. And something about that statement should have felt unsettling, but it did not, because there was no intrusion in it, no claim, only observation. And Charlotte considered that, her thoughts moving not with suspicion, but with a quiet understanding that whatever connection existed here had not begun tonight. It had simply revealed itself, and the faint sound of a car pulling up nearby drew her attention for a moment, headlights gliding across the pavement before settling into stillness. And the driver stepped out, opening the rear door with a practiced motion that spoke of routine, of a life that operated on a different scale. And Charlotte glanced back at him, a question forming without words, and he met it easily. "Come," he said, not as a command, not as an expectation, but as an invitation, and for a brief second, Charlotte hesitated, not out of fear, not out of doubt, but because she recognized the quiet significance of this moment. Not the car, not the man, but the choice. The simple act of stepping forward without needing to justify it. And as she moved, closing the small distance between them, there was no sense of being led, only the feeling of walking into something she had already decided. And as she settled into the car, the door closing softly behind her, the world outside dimming into reflections of light and motion, Charlotte allowed herself one last glance back through the window, not toward the restaurant, not toward the past, but toward the space she had just stepped beyond. And this time, she did not look for anything left behind, because there was nothing there waiting for her anymore. The city moved around her in blurred reflections as the car pulled away from the curb, the glow of streetlights stretching across the glass like fragments of a life she had already stepped beyond. And Charlotte sat back against the seat, her hands resting loosely in her lap, not tense, not guarded, simply still, as if her body had finally caught up to the quiet certainty that had settled inside her. And for a moment she did not speak, allowing the rhythm of the road, the soft hum of the engine, and the distant pulse of Manhattan at night to fill the space between them. And beside her, he did not rush to fill that silence either, his presence steady, composed, as though he understood that this was not a moment for questions, but for recognition. And Charlotte turned her gaze slightly toward him, studying the calm precision of his posture, the way he carried himself with an ease that suggested not just wealth, but control, the kind that came from knowing exactly where he stood in every room he entered. And yet there was something else beneath it, something quieter, something that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with awareness. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, blending seamlessly into the quiet interior of the car. "You were never what he said you were," he said, not as reassurance, not as comfort, but as fact. And Charlotte felt the words settle differently than anything she had heard before, because they did not try to fix anything. They did not try to rewrite her past. They simply acknowledged what had always been there. And she let out a soft breath, her eyes drifting briefly to the passing city before returning to him. "You speak like you know me," she said, her tone calm, without suspicion, without defense. And he met her gaze without hesitation. "I know enough," he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, only quiet certainty. And Charlotte considered that, not searching for proof, not questioning his intention, but recognizing the weight of being seen without needing to explain herself. And as the car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softening into something more distant, she felt a subtle shift, not in him, but in herself, the realization that this moment was not about being rescued, not about being elevated by someone else's power, but about stepping into something she had already built on her own, something he simply recognized. And the car slowed, gliding to a stop in front of a building that rose in clean lines of glass and steel, its presence understated yet unmistakably exclusive. And the driver stepped out once more, opening the door with the same quiet efficiency. And Charlotte paused for just a second before stepping out, her heels meeting the pavement with a soft, steady sound. And as she looked up at the building, taking in its height, its quiet authority against the night sky, she felt no intimidation, no hesitation, only a calm awareness that she belonged wherever she chose to stand. And beside her, he joined her without a word, his presence aligning with hers rather than overshadowing it. And as they moved toward the entrance, the doors opening seamlessly as if expecting them, Charlotte did not look back, not at the street, not at the path they had taken, because the direction she was moving now did not require comparison. It did not require validation. It simply required her to keep walking forward, exactly as she was. The lobby welcomed her not with noise, but with silence, the kind that spoke of exclusivity rather than emptiness, polished marble stretching beneath her feet, reflecting soft amber lighting that seemed designed to calm rather than impress. And Charlotte stepped inside without hesitation, her posture steady, her pace unhurried, as if she had walked through spaces like this her entire life, even if she had not, because something had changed, not in the world around her, but in the way she moved through it. And the man beside her matched that rhythm effortlessly, not leading her forward, not guiding her, simply walking in parallel as though their paths had already aligned long before this moment. And a receptionist glanced up briefly, recognition flickering across her face before she offered a respectful nod, her voice low and precise as she greeted him by name. "Good evening, Mr. Knight." And that was the first time Charlotte heard it clearly. The name that carried weight in rooms she had never entered before, Alexander Knight. And the way it settled into the space was different from how Ethan's name had once filled a room. There was no performance attached to it, no need to assert importance, because it was already understood, and Charlotte did not react outwardly. She did not turn to him with surprise or question, but something inside her aligned quietly, as if the final piece of a pattern she had sensed all night had now revealed itself, and they moved toward the elevator, its doors opening with a soft, seamless motion. And as they stepped inside, the city beyond the glass walls rose slowly around them, lights stretching into the distance like constellations grounded in steel and glass. And Charlotte watched them for a moment, not with awe, but with a quiet awareness of how far she had come from the version of herself who once measured her worth through proximity to someone else's success. And beside her, Alexander remained composed, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze forward, as if he trusted the silence to hold everything. That did not need to be said, and when the elevator came to a stop, the doors opening into a private floor that felt less like a space and more like a statement, Charlotte stepped out first, not waiting, not hesitating, her movements natural, unforced, as if she had already accepted that she belonged here. And the room beyond was expansive but not overwhelming, glass walls framing the skyline, furnishings minimal yet deliberate, everything placed with intention rather than excess. And Charlotte walked a few steps in, her eyes tracing the edges of the space before settling on the view beyond, the city stretching endlessly beneath them. And for a moment, she simply stood there, not taking it in as something extraordinary, but as something that existed, something she could choose to be part of or walk away from. And behind her, Alexander spoke again, his voice calm, grounded. "This is where I work," he said, not as a boast, not as an explanation, just a statement of fact. And Charlotte turned slightly, her expression thoughtful. "And you brought me here," she replied, her tone even, and there was no assumption in her words, only curiosity. And he met her gaze, steady and direct. "I brought you here because you were already standing on your own," he said, and the simplicity of it settled deeper than anything else he had said, because it confirmed what she had already begun to understand, that none of this was about being chosen, about being lifted, about being saved. It was about being seen exactly as she was, without reduction, without distortion. And Charlotte let that realization settle fully, her gaze softening slightly as she looked out over the city once more, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel not just the absence of her past, but the presence of something new, something undefined but entirely hers, waiting not to be given, but to be claimed. Charlotte did not rush to fill the silence that followed, because the space around her no longer demanded that she prove anything. And as she stood before the glass, the city stretching endlessly beneath her like a living map of possibility, she felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not excitement, not disbelief, but clarity, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And behind her, Alexander remained where he was, allowing the moment to belong to her without stepping into it, without shaping it. And that restraint spoke louder than anything he could have said, because it confirmed what she was beginning to understand, that this was not a world she was being invited into as a guest, but one she could step into as herself. And slowly, Charlotte turned, her eyes meeting his again, steady, composed. "You said you have been watching me," she said, her tone calm, not accusing, not uncertain, simply direct. And Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the question without hesitation. "I did," he replied, his voice even, not from a distance meant to control, but from a place of recognition. And Charlotte studied him for a moment, not searching for inconsistency, not trying to uncover hidden motives, but measuring the truth of his words against the quiet certainty she had felt all evening. And she realized that nothing in his presence contradicted that feeling, nothing suggested performance or manipulation, only consistency, only awareness. And she took a slow step forward, closing a small part of the distance between them, not out of necessity, but by choice. "And what exactly did you recognize?" she asked, her voice soft but unwavering. And Alexander's gaze did not shift, did not falter as he answered. "Someone who was never what they were told they were," he said, and the words landed with a weight that felt earned rather than given. And Charlotte let out a quiet breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, not from relief, but from alignment, as if something within her had been named without being altered, and she glanced once more toward the skyline before returning her focus to him. "Most people would have stepped in sooner," she said, and there was no accusation in it, only observation, and Alexander allowed a brief pause before responding, his expression thoughtful. "Most people mistake timing for power," he said, "but power is knowing when something does not need to be interrupted." And Charlotte absorbed that, recognizing the truth in it, because tonight had not required rescue. It had required presence. It had required her to stand on her own before anything else could hold meaning. And that understanding settled deeper than anything else, reshaping the way she viewed not only him, but the entire sequence of events that had led her here. And as the quiet of the room wrapped around them, the city lights reflecting softly against the glass, Charlotte realized that this moment was not the climax of something, but the beginning of something far less defined, something that would not be dictated by past narratives or expectations. And she moved again, this time toward the edge of the room where a single chair faced the skyline, her fingers brushing lightly against its back before she turned slightly, her posture relaxed, grounded. "So what happens now?" she asked, not as a question of direction, but as a recognition of possibility. And Alexander watched her for a moment, his expression unchanged, steady, before answering in the same calm tone that had defined him all evening. "Now," he said, "you decide what is worth your time." And the simplicity of it settled over her like a final shift, because it placed the future exactly where it belonged, not in his hands, not in anyone else's, but in hers. And for the first time that night, Charlotte allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile, not for him, not for the moment, but for herself, because she understood that whatever came next would not be something she stepped into blindly. It would be something she chose, fully, deliberately, without needing to look back. Charlotte did not answer immediately, not because she did not have one, but because for the first time, the answer was not shaped by urgency, by expectation, or by someone else's timeline. And as she stood there, the city lights stretching endlessly before her, she allowed herself to feel the weight of that freedom, not as something overwhelming, but as something precise, something that required intention. And she realized that this was what had been missing before, not opportunity, not even strength, but the quiet permission to choose without being defined by the choice itself. And behind her, Alexander remained still, his presence unchanged, as if he understood that this moment belonged entirely to her, that whatever she decided next would not need his influence to hold value. And Charlotte turned slowly, her gaze settling on him once more, not searching, not questioning, but seeing him clearly within the space he occupied, not as a solution, not as an escape, but as someone who had simply stepped into alignment with a version of her that already existed. And she took another step forward, her movements unhurried, deliberate, her voice calm when she finally spoke. "Then I decide not to go back," she said, and the words were not dramatic, not charged with emotion, but firm in a way that made them absolute. And Alexander inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without interruption, because it did not require validation, it simply existed. And Charlotte continued, her tone steady, "Not to him, not to who I was when I believed him, not to any version of myself that needed to be approved." And as she spoke, the clarity within her sharpened, not as a reaction to the evening, but as a culmination of everything that had led her here, everything she had already rebuilt without realizing it. And Alexander's gaze remained steady, not evaluating, not judging, simply present. And when he responded, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that had defined every word he had spoken. "That is the only decision that matters," he said, and Charlotte felt a subtle shift at that, not because it confirmed her choice, but because it reflected it back to her without distortion, without adding weight or expectation. And for a moment, the room fell into silence again, not the heavy silence of uncertainty, but the kind that followed something final, something complete, and Charlotte moved past him then, not away, not toward anything specific, but simply forward, her steps carrying her across the room with a sense of ease that had nothing to do with where she was and everything to do with who she had become. And as she reached the far side of the glass wall, her reflection faintly visible against the city beyond, she paused, studying it not with scrutiny, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if seeing herself without the layers that had once been placed over her. And behind her, Alexander did not follow immediately, giving her that space, that distance, because he understood that whatever came next would not be something he initiated, but something she chose to allow. And Charlotte lifted her gaze once more, looking out over the skyline, and for the first time, she did not measure herself against it, did not compare her life to what lay beyond. She simply saw it as a landscape she could step into on her own terms. And when she finally turned back, her expression had shifted just slightly, not softer, not harder, but clearer, as if something within her had settled into its final place, and she walked back toward him with the same quiet confidence, stopping just close enough for her presence to be felt without needing to be announced. And in that moment, nothing needed to be said, because the decision had already been made, not about him, not about the future, but about herself, and everything else would follow from that. The room did not change, but Charlotte did, and that difference was enough to alter everything around her, because now every surface, every reflection, every line of light across the glass felt less like something to step into and more like something she could shape. And as she stood there with Alexander just a few steps away, she realized that this moment was no longer about what had happened earlier. That night, it was not about Ethan, not about the dinner, not even about the words that had shifted the room. It was about what remained after all of that had fallen away, and what remained was her, unfiltered, uncontained, and entirely her own. And she let that settle fully, not rushing it, not questioning it, simply allowing it to exist. And for the first time, she felt no pull backward, no quiet thread tying her to the version of herself that had once needed to be seen differently, because she understood now that she had never needed to be redefined, only recognized. And that recognition had come not from someone else giving it to her, but from her finally accepting it. And Alexander watched her without interruption, his presence steady but never intrusive, as if he understood that this was not a moment to guide, but a moment to witness. And Charlotte turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze once more, and there was something different in the way she looked at him now, not curiosity, not distance, but clarity, the kind that comes when there is nothing left to prove. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same quiet certainty. "You did not change anything tonight," she said. And there was no accusation in it, no challenge, only truth. And Alexander inclined his head slightly, accepting the statement without hesitation. "I know," he replied, his tone even, and Charlotte allowed a faint breath to pass through her lips, her eyes softening just slightly, not with vulnerability, but with understanding, because that was exactly what made the difference. Not what he had done, but what he had not needed to do. And she took a step closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to shift the space between them into something intentional, something chosen. "You just made it impossible for anyone else to ignore," she added quietly. And for a brief moment, something almost imperceptible moved through Alexander's expression, not surprise, not pride, but acknowledgement, as if she had articulated something he had already understood. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, filled with everything that did not need to be spoken. And Charlotte turned once more toward the skyline, her reflection faint against the glass. But this time she did not study it. She did not search it for answers or validation. She simply saw it as part of the world she now moved through without hesitation. And behind her, Alexander remained where he was, not stepping forward, not closing the space, because he understood that whatever came next would not be defined by proximity, but by choice. And Charlotte took a slow breath, her shoulders settling into a stillness that felt permanent, not temporary. And in that moment, the entire evening aligned into something simple, something clear, not a story of revenge, not a moment of triumph over someone else, but a quiet, undeniable return to herself. And as she turned back once more, her gaze steady, her presence unshaken, it was evident in the way she stood, in the way she moved, in the way the room now seemed to adjust around her rather than the other way around, that nothing about her needed to be elevated, nothing needed to be repaired, because she had never been less than what she was, and now, finally, that truth no longer required permission to exist. The city did not quiet as the night deepened. It continued to move, to pulse, to exist beyond the glass in a rhythm that no single story could interrupt. And Charlotte stood within that rhythm now, no longer observing it from a distance, no longer measuring herself against it, but simply part of it, grounded in a way that did not need to be declared. And as the reflection of the skyline stretched faintly across the polished floor behind her, she felt the final shift settle into place, not as a moment of arrival, but as a recognition of something that had been unfolding long before this night began, something that did not depend on Ethan's downfall or Alexander's presence, but on her own quiet decision to stop seeing herself through someone else's narrative. And she turned slowly, her gaze moving once more to Alexander, who had not moved, who had not needed to, his presence as steady as it had been from the moment he stood up in that dining room. And for a brief second, they simply looked at each other, not as strangers, not as savior and saved, but as two people who had recognized something real without needing to define it immediately. And Charlotte gave the smallest nod, not as agreement, not as commitment, but as acknowledgement, and Alexander returned it just as simply, because neither of them needed to fill the moment with promises or expectations. And that was what made it different, what made it real. And Charlotte stepped past him then, not away, not toward, but forward, her movement unhurried, her posture relaxed, as she made her way toward the exit of the space, her heels soft against the floor, each step carrying a quiet certainty that did not need to be announced. And when she reached the door, she paused. For just a fraction of a second, her hand resting lightly against the handle, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the significance of leaving this moment exactly as it was, complete without needing to be prolonged. And as she opened the door, the corridor beyond greeted her with the same quiet elegance, the same understated sense of space, and she stepped through without looking back, because there was nothing behind her that required her attention anymore. And as the door closed softly, the sound barely audible, it marked not an ending, but a continuation, something that would unfold beyond this night, beyond this building, beyond this single turning point. And inside the room, Alexander remained where he was for a moment longer, his gaze resting briefly on the space she had just left, not with regret, not with urgency, but with a calm understanding that whatever came next would not be something he pursued, but something that would meet him again when